Alright, so we're going to start off with answering number 1. Identify the author's argument, main idea, or thesis. And we could tell that off the bat that the main claim that the author makes is the benefits of child labor. From the start, we could tell that the sweatshops benefit children title has a negative connotation to it because it gives a lousy tone because of the horrid working conditions in these sweatshops that they give to their workers. And in this case, the workers are the children. This concept might seem very ambiguous because parents do not usually choose labor over school, but since we are not given the reason why he chose labor over school, the reason why his 15-year-old daughter is working is to benefit herself and her family with the money that she has earned, which kind of gives evidence or support to the main claim that sweatshops do benefit children. But in this paragraph, the author gives evidence of the unsavory working conditions of child laborers who are working 12 or more shifts. Well, the author gives 2 reporters named Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wooden. And now this may seem like a credible source, but we really don't know if it's valid because we don't know who these interviewers are. But in the interview, they interviewed Monko Lalicorn. I'm sorry if I butcher it, but he interviews Monko Lalicorn, a laborer who has his daughter work as well too. So instead of her going to school, he has her working in a factory for clothing for export to America. Since we know that the author is defending child labor, the claim of unsavory working conditions in Cambodian factories can be used as a counter-argument to build the rest of the author's argument. And that answers question 2. We know this because in the next section, he will contradict this whole evidence of the working conditions in Cambodia.
Okay. Third world countries need the advantage of cheap labor. Automatically, the words cheap labor give off a negative connotation because we know that cheap means they're not getting paid fairly or they're not getting paid the just amount for the work that people are doing. And then it says, in truth, every prosperous country on the planet today went through an industrial period heavily reliant on sweatshop labor. So, meaning that it's heavily reliant means that it's necessary for the success of countries. Automatically, it's not talking about how children benefit. Instead, it's saying how prosperous countries benefit from cheap labor and sweatshop labor. Then it goes on to say, the United States, Britain, France, Sweden, and others all rode to modernity on the back of child laborers. So the people suffering for the success of countries are children. These are our victims. And then it says, the choice was simple. Kids worked or they went hungry. Okay. So, saying that there was only 2 choices basically justifies child labor because they have the opportunity to earn money. But then it says, it wasn't a terribly rosy set of choices, but at least the choice was available. So addressing that it wasn't a terribly rosy set of choices shows that the children do suffer and the children pay the price for other countries to succeed. And then it says, anti-globalization activists are doing their dangest to make sure choice isn't available to those living in today's fledgling economies. So it's automatically calling out the opposing side. But it's not giving it's not providing the argument that the opposing side is making, maybe because the author knows that anti-globalization activists have a stronger argument than the people who say children benefit from sweatshops. And then it goes on to say, critics counter that unlike in the early 20th century, Western companies today are wealthy enough to pay living wages, to establish comfortable working conditions, and to protect third world environments. So it says unlike in the early 20th century, but it's not providing sufficient evidence as to what changed. It's just saying that the working conditions are different from the early 20th century, but it's not saying how. So the conditions might still be bad, just not as bad as the early 20th century. And then it says Western companies today are wealthy enough to pay living wages. So this is living is enough to survive. But is it really beneficial if they're not paying children fairly? They're just paying them enough to survive. So the children might not get paid the fair amount for their hard work. And then it says to establish comfortable working conditions. The word comfortable is very broad because what might be comfortable to third world countries might be not comfortable to people in first world countries. So the word comfortable needs to be clarified. What is comfortable to the people in third world countries? Is it actually comfortable? Is it actually what comfortable? Is it actually what they deserve? Are the working conditions safe and healthy and beneficial for the kids? And then it says, and to protect third world environments. Okay, it says they may be right. So saying they may be right it's saying the author is saying that the opposing side might be right, but it's not saying why or how. So the author is not addressing the opposing side's argument. Again, this might be because the author knows that the opposing side has a stronger argument, so he's simply just saying they may be right without giving evidence as to why they may be right. Maybe because of fear that he is wrong. And then he says, but then what advantage would there be to investing in the developing world in the first place? Okay, so claiming that writing this question shows that the author's interest is not in benefiting children, but instead in developing the world. So this shows greedy desires to develop the world at the price of children. And we all know children are vulnerable and do not know what fair pay is. They do not know the pay that they deserve for their hard work. So making this claim actually shows that the children aren't benefiting and that this is just a selfish desire to develop the world. And then it says cheap labor is the only, this is not a bad word, it says CHIT, chit, the third world has to lure much needed Western investment. So it's justifying cheap labor because it is needed for Western investment. But it's not saying how children benefit from this. It's only saying how Western corporations benefit from this. Then it says, take it away and there's no reason for Western corporations to incur the cost of putting up factories, shipping, security, and the bevy of other expenses that come with maintaining plants overseas. So these last two sentences, do not provide reasoning behind the author's main argument. So the last two sentences do not provide reasoning behind the author's main argument that children benefit from cheap labor. Instead, the author is just saying that Western corporations benefit from cheap labor and children labor. All in all, the author's evidence is not effective in supporting his argument and strengthening his claims and his argument because he is not providing sufficient evidence behind how children benefit. Instead, it's just saying how children can survive, but they're not really getting the fair pay that they deserve.
In section 3, the author talks about how free trade beats sweatshops. The author says the best way to lessen the plight of sweatshop workers is more free trade, not less. If workers make 75 cents per day in Factory A, the only plant in town, the best thing that could happen to them would be a second factory to open up. If Factory B pays less than 75 cents, it will not attract any workers. If it offers exactly 75 cents, it might attract a few workers who couldn't get jobs in Factory A. If it pays more than 75 cents, however, it might attract the best and brightest from Factory A. Factory A then must decide whether to up its wages or look for new labor, which means more jobs. In this section, the author talks about the significance of sweatshops, but expands how free trade could beat it. This does not expand the claim, but it gives the reader an insight as to what the advantages of free trade. This section adds to the argument because it shows that the idea of free trade is more beneficial than the process of working in sweatshops.
Okay, so sweatshops lead to success. So recent history teems with examples of how sweatshop labor has helped poor economies lead to prosperity, and then uses an ellipses. So this is our line of reasoning because it's explaining why it's prosperous for the economy. Starts off with recent history, so the evidence that follows is going to be historical. So starts off with China and then a dash. So the evidence has no introduction at all, and a dash is actually used throughout. It's used twice along with an ellipses, and that is used to make the evidence more concise. And I do think that's effective because it makes his whole argument better. It's more straightforward. The main part of his argument is have opened to cater to workers with rising income, and then again ellipses. A hint of a middle class has appeared. So this again ties to the line of reasoning with rising incomes. Overall, I do think this piece was effective because it does give credit to Christoph and Houdon. And since it's so concise, I think that it's really helping his argument. So then follows with Swedish economist John Norberg, and then an ellipses, predicts that all of South and East Asia will be prosperous enough to ban child labor entirely by 2010. So this is overall not a good piece of evidence because of the fact it's just a prediction. But the key point here was prosperous enough to ban child labor. This is the main part of his argument because the author isn't really saying that sweatshops need to remain. It's just sweatshops need to be applied until the country is prosperous enough to live without them. Then the author ends with, but that's just it. A country must be able to afford to ban child labor before child labor is pulled out from under it. So the author takes more of a economical stance, seeing as child labor as more effective, rather than child labor being wrong.